We've learned a little bit about Burkean conservatism, which is a more traditional version of conservatism that emerged in the wake of the. And now I want to turn to an American conservative, Russell Kirk, who is in the Jeffersonian and Burkean conservative tradition. There he is, looking mighty dapper. One thing you'll notice if you Google Russell Kirk is that he was quite a dresser, and in his youth was, I have no other word for it, dapper. That is a well put together guy. As is my habit, I went to an authoritative source online for the biographical material about Russell Kirk to get what I would assume Russell Kirk would himself approve of, which I try to do when I can. So this material is from the Russell Kirk Center, which actually exists on the Kirk property and utilizes his home. Russell Kirk's dates are 1918 to 1994, and that means that he didn't live to be very old. He lived to be 76 years old. And at the beginning of his biographical material on the Russell Kirk Center website, it says, for more than 40 years, Russell Kirk was in the thick of the intellectual controversies of his time. He is the author of some 32 books, hundreds of periodical essays, and many short stories. Both Time and Newsweek have described him as one of America's leading thinkers, and the New York Times acknowledged the scale of his influence when in 1998 it wrote that Kirk's 1953 book, The Conservative Mind, quote, gave American conservatives an identity and a genealogy and catalyzed the post-war movement. And I might just add that this was probably written at a time when Time and Newsweek weren't as thin and devoid of substantive content as they seem to be now. I remember growing up that Time and Newsweek were fairly well-respected and authoritative magazines, but I've taken a look at them recently, and it seems as though they've adopted the idea that the American reader has a very short attention span. Quoting again from the site, Dr. Kirk wrote and spoke on modern culture, political thought and practice, educational theory, literary criticism, ethical questions, and social themes. He addressed audiences on hundreds of American campuses and appeared often on television and radio. So you might say that Russell Kirk was a leading public intellectual, and he in some ways was part of the movement that popularized conservatism, but as we'll see, he departed company from the type of conservative which became predominant in American conservative movements. And we see that departure coming out in his agrarianism and in the classical bent of his particular kind of conservatism. He is one of the few influential conservative thinkers that America has produced. A little bit more material from the bio. He edited the educational quarterly journal, the University Bookman, and was founder and first editor of the quarterly Modern Age. He contributed articles to numerous serious periodicals on either side of the Atlantic. For a quarter of a century, he wrote a page on education for National Review, which was a conservative weekly, which still exists, and for 13 years published through the Los Angeles Times Syndicate, a nationally syndicated newspaper column. The Modern Age still exists too. It's run by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which is a conservative, education-oriented think tank. His second book, The Conservative Mind, 1953, is one of the most widely reviewed and discussed studies of political ideas in this century and has gone through 7 editions. Well, I had you read a piece by Alan Carlson from the blog The Imaginative Conservative. It's the imaginativeconservative.org. The piece was entitled Russell Kirk, Northern Agrarianism and the Function-Rich Family. The Imaginative Conservative is a blog that promotes an alternative type of conservatism that is more agrarian and more classically oriented and differs from the contemporary type of conservatism that's most popular, or at least was until recently. Everything's kind of up for grabs at the moment. But until at least recently, the predominant type of conservatism was a free market-oriented type conservatism that had a lot to do with economics, and a diminishing amount to do with the family, community, and things like that, although it speaks to that, but the emphasis is on economics. Whereas the type of conservatism that's promoted by the imaginative conservative is a sort of communitarian type of conservative, an older type of conservatism that is more along the Burkean lines. So one of the things that is mentioned in this article is the Southern Agrarian tradition. And I have a picture up there of a book that was very influential in establishing the Southern Agrarian tradition with these so-called 12 Southerners, 12 authors who contributed to this book, I'll Take My Stand, the South and the Agrarian Tradition. Of the Southern Agrarians, Ralph Ansel wrote in the First Principles Journal, "The Southern Agrarians comprise primarily the 12 Southern writers who authored the book I'll Take My Stand from 1930, a kind of manifesto against modernism. The authors were John Crow Ransom, Andrew Little, Henry B. Klein, Stark Young, Lyle Lanier, Frank Owsley, Alan Tate, Donald Davidson, John Gould Fletcher, Herman Nixon, Robert Penn Warren, and John Donald Wade. Many of the contributors had earlier formed a literary group and a magazine called The Fugitive. The image of the agrarian as their ideal developed later as they became increasingly aware that the South had certain features worth preserving and that central to the good things of life they wanted to defend was social stability and closeness to the soil." I wanted to just mention them and note their influence because, as the author of the imaginative conservative piece points out, Russell Kirk in many ways reflects the values of the Southern agrarians, even though he's a Northern agrarian because of where he happened to live, which is in Michigan, not exactly a Southern state. But he was influenced by the Southern agrarians as well as the Jeffersonian tradition, and of course the conservatism of Burke. Ansel writes, "The Southern agrarians stressed that human nature is as frail as it is constant. The forces of rapid change and heightened consumption oppress a soul that requires stability, closeness to inscrutable creation, and a sense of the holy and mysterious in life. They complained that modern ways of living, aided and abetted by science, never let man rest, since such ways were at peace with neither society nor creation. In industrial modernity, the human soul is brutalized and exploited to an extent equaled only by the suffering of creation in general. Industrialism, in fact, wages continuous warfare on creation, ceaselessly endeavoring to exploit and manipulate her in the name of material progress. This total commitment to a Cartesian matter in motion elbows out the satisfaction of higher needs. Opposed to this abyss of infinite change, the agrarian sought a way of life that could be lived with grace and piety, and with enough leisure to allow tradition, custom, and manners to flourish." I might say the other reason why I'm introducing the Southern agrarians and Russell Kirk at this point is because soon we will be looking at Wendell Berry's ideas in more depth. And Wendell Berry also owes some of his thought, some of his heritage comes from the Southern agrarians and the Jeffersonian agrarianism. And so there's quite a bit of overlap between the sentiments that will be expressed by Kirk and the way that Wendell Berry thinks as well. Strangely enough, Wendell Berry has a reputation in the United States, unless people know his work well, of being a really radical element, somebody who's a real radical left-winger and sort of dangerous and subversive. If you really read carefully a text, you find sometimes that the assumptions about an author are very, very different from the reality of that author, and that you can't learn about the author any other way than by carefully reading what he or she has to say. That would be the case with Russell Kirk as well, who maybe has a reputation for being a type of conservative that he wasn't. And in going into this area, we can say that it's remote enough from our experience at this point, this particular perspective is remote enough from our experience that it constitutes an alternative, you might say, to the phenomenon that we've spent so much time kind of going back and forth in this class and trying to get around, which is the left-right dichotomy. We spent quite a bit of time on anarchisms, some of which try to get around it or go above it or under it or in some way bypass the left-right dichotomy. And this way of thinking also has potential for doing that. And that's hopeful, because in order to change things, we probably need to go beyond the back and forth left and right way of thinking that has not necessarily served us terribly well in the past couple of decades. So Kirk discovered the Southern Agrarians in 1938, and your article quotes him in response to them, saying, Christian humanism, stern criticism of the industrialized mass society, detestation of communism and other forms of collectivism, attachment to the ways of the Old South, such were the principles uniting Southern agrarians. And these were the principles, or some of the principles, that Kirk also resonated with. Of special note there is the criticism of industrialized mass society. This is what made the Southern agrarians somewhat dubious about capitalism unchecked. And also note the detestation of communism. So they were certainly also very critical of any form of collectivism. And so you can see what unifies them is a skepticism about materialism and a longing to preserve and extend a more spiritual perspective. Your article also mentions the 10 conservative principles that are actually culled from Kirk's book from the 1950s, The Conservative Mind, and then added to, I think 7 through 10 were added later by Kirk in the early 90s. So I found them also on the Russell Kirk Center website, and so I got these 10 from the full 10 from there. These stay at a fairly abstract level, but you can see within them the Burkean nature of Kirk's conservatism, and you can think about how some of this would apply to people's relationship to the land, to the food system, as well as to each other. The first conservative principle is the conservative believes that there exists an enduring moral order. So this amounts to a claim that the moral order does not change according to individual or group whim. That is, it doesn't endorse moral relativism. But then the next principle, second, the conservative adheres to custom, convention, and continuity. That would seem like it contradicts the first one, but it really reflects Edmund Burke's embrace of both. In other words, there's an underlying moral order, or Burke sometimes called it natural law, or even natural rights. But at the same time, there's this strong element of custom and convention in various societies that needs to be respected. Burke said that we can't just toss out customs and cultural differences because they don't line up with some sort of abstract universal principle. They need to be respected and preserved and changed slowly if they need change, so that you can retain cultural and societal cohesion and stability. Third, conservatives believe in what may be called the principle of prescription. This is explained on the Kirk website as conservatives sense that modern people are dwarves on the shoulders of giants, able to see farther than their ancestors only because of the great stature of those who preceded us in time. Therefore, conservatives very often emphasize the importance of prescription, that is, of things established by immemorial usage, so that the mind of man runneth not to the contrary. So that establishes respect for practices from the past, which also lends itself to stability. Fifth, conservatives pay attention to the principle of variety, which they define as a healthy diversity in any civilization. There must survive orders and classes, differences in material condition, and many sorts of inequality. And there's a strong statement here against egalitarianism, of insisting that everybody fit the same mold, and that there shouldn't be any outliers. Sixth, the principle of imperfectibility claims that man being imperfect, no perfect social order can ever be created. So that's another statement against utopianism, which can cause government to become overbearing and tyrannical. Seventh, conservatives are persuaded that freedom and property are closely linked. From here we get the notion that, similar to Locke's argument, that a person who doesn't have the right to own the property that he or she has mixed his or her labor with, or has accumulated, is too vulnerable to tyrannical government and too vulnerable to the predations of others. But it also reflects the idea through agrarianism that especially property and land and the ability to use it to supply yourself and others locally and directly gives people more independence relative to government, relative to other people in other places as well. It's a source of freedom and independence. The eighth principle is conservatives uphold voluntary community quite as they oppose involuntary collectivism. So in other words, in opposing involuntary collectivism of, typically the communist kind or the socialist kind, the corollary is that they promote voluntary community. So this is a statement that runs contrary to the strong individualism of contemporary conservatism. Kirk was very interested in fostering genuine community with deep roots in the local land and local private organizations and associations and in local politics. Again, that local self-sufficiency that can only be fostered by community, where people go beyond their individual self-interest and work together to support each other. The ninth principle, the conservative perceives the need for prudent restraints upon power and upon human passions. This is a statement against strong, powerful government, again, but it's also a statement against what's referred to here as anarchy, in which, quote, every person claims to be a power unto himself, end quote. So we need to have government that's strong enough that it doesn't allow for people to basically run rampant alongside communities that are strong enough to resist the encroachment of government where it doesn't belong in their day-to-day relationships with each other and in their day-to-day interactions, both socially and economically. And the 10th principle, the thinking conservative understands that permanence and change must be recognized and reconciled in a vigorous society. Very much a Burkean line of argument as well. Burke wanted as much tradition and stability as was practicable, but he also recognized the need for society to change when necessary, to adjust. And so there has to be this balance between tradition and stability and change. And of course, Burke called for the reform mindset rather than the revolutionary mindset in this regard. Here Kirk argues that there is this love of progress in liberal societies that tends to worship any and all progress and to denigrate what is old and what has preserved society. But the conservative shouldn't go the other way in his view and basically promote the ossification of society. There has to be intelligent ability to adjust with the times when adjustments are necessary. So many of these principles can be applied to the topics that we've been discussing of agricultural and food systems and the environment. For instance, the idea that the enduring moral order and custom and convention can coexist. A belief in an enduring moral order can provide people with a basis for criticizing existing practices confidently and proposing new ones that perhaps reflect better basic truths of morality and justice, but also respect and understand that how people do things and the way that they have come to live needs to be respected and worked with. In other words, too often have reformers not really reformed, but kind of rolled in and try to change people's habits, beliefs, customs, and values very, very quickly because that makes sense to them. And what comes out of that is a lot of anger and frustration and disgruntlement and lack of cooperation on the part of the people who are being changed, so to speak. So respect and care needs to be taken when creating changes. Certainly that would be the case in any sort of change in our food production. When things are done rapidly, as they were, for instance, in the early Soviet Union when they tried to change from independent farming, individual farming to collective farming, and the result of that attempt was a widespread famine because the farmers weren't interested in losing their land and becoming factory farm workers. The principle of imperfectibility goes along with that too. There's a lot of cautions against ideological extremism in these statements. Also, obviously, the idea that freedom and property are closely linked is very applicable to what we've been talking about and has been echoed by, it's the whole Jeffersonian notion that your independence comes from your ability to provide for yourself. Then Carlson talks about several Northern agrarian themes in Kirk. I won't go through all of them, but I'll highlight a few. Third is a suspicion of raw capitalism, and right from the start, the author mentions Wendell Berry, who, he says, labels capitalism the economy of the bulldozer, and the 12 Southerners called modern advertising the great effort of false economy of life to approve itself. He goes on to point out that Kirk was not an enemy of free enterprise, and called it the most productive and liberal economic arrangement conceivable, but he says he faulted libertarian economists such as Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek for the narrowness of their economic thought. So in Kirk's position, the economy should serve people instead of people serving the economy. He sees laissez-faire economics as being brought into existence, he says, as a companion to the centralizing state. In other words, it empowers the state to the extent that it takes away power from individuals and communities due to mechanisms we've already talked about in this course. And then I also wanted to highlight the fourth agrarian theme, a respect for the vital, function-rich family. First of all, I thought it was really cute, actually, the way that Kirk talked about the farm baby. I don't know if he has any sort of empirical proof for this, but I just thought this was great writing. They quote Kirk saying, "The rickety and scrofulous little wretch who first sees light in a workhouse or in a brothel, and who feels the effects of alcohol before the effects of vital air, is not equal in any respect to the ruddy offspring of the honest yeoman. Nay, I will go further and say that a prince, provided he is no better born than royal blood will make him, is not equal to the healthy son of a peasant. The ruddy offspring of the honest yeoman versus the rickety and scrofulous little wretch from the workhouse or brothel." I think you can tell right there what he thought of a lot of big cities. So the author says that he championed the idea of the companionship family, in which husband and wife work together and the whole farm family works together, the children included, to support themselves. He champions that as more dignified by far than the type of labor that he envisioned taking place in the city of mechanized factory labor. Another one that we probably haven't touched on too much in other sections is the eighth, a wariness towards war. The author points out that Kirk opposed American entry into the Second World War because he believed that President Roosevelt, was, quote, maneuvering the nation into the European conflict. He denounced the peacetime military draft as slavery, and after Pearl Harbor he was furious over the federal government's internment of Japanese Americans in concentration camps, and in 1944 he actually voted for the Socialist Party's Norman Thomas in gratitude for his pre-war anti-imperialist speeches. But he points out he was not a pacifist. He opposed the first Gulf War of '91, but he was for the Vietnam War, probably because it was the fighting of communists. And it says he came to detest George H.W. Bush for his carpet bombing of the cradle of civilization with its taking of 250,000 lives in Iraq. So in foreign policy and war, Russell Kirk was not a predictable contemporary conservative, definitely not a neoconservative in this regard. I think it's really telling that he voted for a Socialist Party candidate in 1944. That despite the fact that he didn't like collectivism, but he actually saw the Roosevelt administration as, through getting us into the war, promoting centralization and mass industrialization and a real change in the American economy, which it did do. But one can certainly argue that the intervention was absolutely necessary given the situation. And I also just wanted to point out at the very end of the article, there's a title, A Glimpse of God, which deals with Kirk's spirituality to a certain extent. Kind of interesting quote from Kirk, that he, quote, understood the truth that ever since the incarnation, material things are luminous and transparent rather than opaque, because it is through them that one can sometimes catch a glimpse of God, end quote. So nature, in his view, reflected the nature of God, in a way. And the author says a little bit later on, an openness to magic and the supernatural rooted in the stories of ancestors and grounded in a vital family home. This is the purest expression of the agrarian ideal. And he attributes those sentiments also to Russell Kirk. So anyway, an interesting figure all around, and one that many people now are not familiar with, even if they are of a conservative bent. So there you have it, and I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about Russell Kirk. All right, bye.